Hi everybody, this is the Vodcast on ADHD, and we're going to begin by discussing some aspects of typical development that are relevant to ADHD. So first, self-regulation. You can think of that as very similar to self-control. The definition is here, control of our emotion, cognition, and behavior. And we can see examples of self-regulation happening automatically and in a more controlled or voluntary way. So for example, when you hear a very loud noise, your instincts are to cover your ears so that you don't hurt your ears, and that would be an example of automatic self-regulation. A more controlled or voluntary example would be raising your hand and waiting your turn to be called on, or standing in line and waiting your turn. So this self-regulation can be at an appropriate level, which is what we see most often, or at an under or over-regulated version of self-regulation. It's also been defined as protecting the self from misfortune, think of covering your ears, and promoting opportunity for positive experiences, right? Taking the time to raise your hand means that the teacher will then call on you and you won't get in trouble. Under the umbrella of self-regulation, we have effortful control. In terms of normative aspects of effortful control, we expect effortful control to be high. Remember, we talked about this in infancy and early toddlerhood, so your ability to kind of control your reactivity. So we would expect it to be high in normative groups, and also we would expect people to show low levels of distractibility and low levels of impulsivity. And all of these functions are related to this idea of effortful control, or to those abilities. We typically see higher levels, baseline levels of effortful control in girls than boys. And I imagine that most of you are familiar with, maybe from a child development class, the work by Walter Mischel known as the marshmallow test. And this was a delay of gratification task, where children were given a marshmallow and said, if you can just sit here with this marshmallow and not eat it, then I will come back and give you a second marshmallow in a couple of minutes. And so some children couldn't wait, and they just ate the one marshmallow, foregoing the opportunity to get the second one. And other kids, they might lick it and smell it and go through all this torture, but they engaged in good effortful control, didn't eat the marshmallow, and then at the end of the day were rewarded for that delay of gratification. And so there are many positive outcomes that were associated for the children who were able to show that delayed gratification and to show that high level of effortful control. Executive function is another category of cognitive skill and capacities that we need to just discuss at sort of the normative level before we talk about ADHD. So executive function, abbreviated as EF, is defined as higher order thinking skills required for planning, organizing, and implementing goal-directed behaviors. It includes a whole host of very specific cognitive abilities, things like inhibition, cognitive flexibility, decision-making, selective attention, right? Your ability to focus on certain stimulation and ignore other stimuli. Working memory abilities, so problem-solving, also creativity, all related to and underlied by executive function. All right, so now we're going to move in to our review of the DSM-5 criteria for ADHD. So, symptom A, a persistent pattern of inattention and or hyperactivity, impulsivity that interferes with functioning or development. So I just want to point out, in the past and past versions of the DSM, we had ADD and ADHD, and people often use the shorthand of ADD. And so you should know that all ADHD is now classified as ADHD. There is no ADD. That does not exist anymore in the DSM-5. So we'll see that more clearly here. So a persistent pattern of inattention and or hyperactivity, impulsivity that interferes with functioning or development. 1, inattention. So if the person shows a persistent pattern of inattention, then they need to have 6 or more of the following, and they need to have persisted for 6 or more months, for at least 6 months. So here are some of these symptoms of inattention. Overlooking details and making careless mistakes. Difficulty sustaining attention in tasks or in play. Doesn't seem to listen when spoken to, so they might seem that their kind of mind is wandering into another place. Doesn't follow through on instructions and fails to finish work, such as homework, chores, duties. Difficulty organizing tasks and activities. This can show as time management problems, being messy, failing to meet deadlines. Avoids or dislikes tasks that require sustained mental effort, so homework, projects, reviewing lengthy reports for work perhaps. loses things readily and easily, easily distracted by extraneous stimuli, and forgetful. So again, you'd need to see 6 or more of the following from this list to get the inattention designation. All right, so now onto the hyperactivity list. Hyperactivity / impulsivity is this dimension. Again, you need to see 6 or more symptoms for a minimum of 6 months. First thing here, fidgets, squirms in seat or taps hands or feet, leaves seat when staying seated is expected, runs about or climbs when inappropriate. In adults with ADHD, there's not as much climbing around and things like that, but a general sense of feeling restless that might be internal. Unable to play or engage in leisure activities quietly. So things like silent reading in school might be nearly impossible. They seem like they're perpetually on the go or driven by a motor. They may be hard to keep up with, perceived as restless by others. Talks excessively. Blurts out answers before the question is even completed, or possibly even finishes other people's sentences, filling in the appropriate words for them. Difficulty waiting his or her turn. Interrupts or intrudes, such as taking over tasks, using things without other people's permissions, interrupting conversations. All right. So those are the big areas there, those symptoms of inattention and hyperactivity impulsivity, and that was our A category of DSM criteria. Then we get down to B. Several of the symptoms that we just reviewed need to have appeared before age 12. Several of the symptoms need to be present in 2 or more settings. The symptoms need to interfere with social, academic, or occupational functioning, and they need not be better explained by another mental disorder. In the diagnostic process, you specify if the individual has the combined presentation, the predominantly inattentive type, or the predominantly hyperactive impulsive type. So again, that's what we're using instead of ADD/ADHD. Also, there would be a specification like we've seen in other disorders with mild, moderate to severe. In terms of prevalence, like other disorders we've talked about, depending on which source or review you use, you see a variety of numbers. I went by the DSM-5. So according to the DSM-5, the prevalence is 5% in children, 2.5% in adults. In other articles that I reviewed, they went as high as 7%. And in certain areas of the country, there's even a map in your textbook that shows you differences by geographic region. You see values going up, prevalence of 15% even. So more prevalent in boys than girls with a rate of 2 to 1. And we often see boys more frequently diagnosed with the hyperactive inattentive type and boys more frequently diagnosed in the hyperactive impulsive category and girls more frequently diagnosed in the inattentive category. Symptoms are hard to distinguish from normative development before age 4. So you can think of things like inattention and hyperactivity being normative aspects of development in a 2 or 3-year-old. So that's why it's hard to distinguish what's developmentally appropriate versus abnormal in a child that young. Therefore, children are usually identified and diagnosed in elementary school, and many remain impaired throughout adulthood. We'll talk more about that with developmental course. In terms of comorbidity,